Zainab, and thank you for having me back here at Sharq Forum. I think really over the past 5 or 6 years, the region has, to put it generally, looked for alternatives. Certainly, as Magdalena pointed out, the US is not necessarily in decline in the region. It still has that significant presence, and that can translate into significant power and influence. But politically, I think the approach, the engagement from the West, from the US, has been abysmal, has been awful. And we see the consequences of that in Syria, for example. We see the consequences certainly in Iraq, where much of the focus has been one of counterterrorism rather than some kind of broader vision and strategy for these countries. And of course, bearing in mind that much of the problems that exist do emanate, if we were to go back to the past 10, 15 years, to the Iraq War, which really set into motion much of the trends, let's say, that we have unfolding and the destabilizing impact that it all had. And really, I think that's the central theme that I think should be, that I think we need to focus on, how engagements can produce long-term costs. We do think of Russia, China as potential alternatives. Certainly, they've become much more assertive. In Russia, I see a reawakened actor rather than a new actor. In China, certainly a new actor. But really, I think the region still is poorly informed as to how these countries operate, where they lie in terms of their values, let's say, and their ideals. Because the Middle East has faced something of a contradiction where there is deep suspicion of Western involvement for historical reasons, US involvement, but at the same time it has embraced the ideals of open politics, of reform, of fundamental freedoms, of democracy, the key demands that underpin the Arab Spring uprisings. But again, of course, it doesn't necessarily want all that to be imposed and enforced by the US, quite frankly, because the record is poor. The West has failed dramatically in that regard, where it certainly had the framework and the vision, it's had all the soft power elements that has made it an ideal global power. But when it comes to implementation, when it comes to, again, the short-term interests, bearing in mind the traditional support it has had for authoritarian regimes, despots, again, a critical reason why the region is in the situation it is today, it's lacked an ideal package where it can have the best of both worlds. And unfortunately, I think the region now finds itself in a position where it has to start thinking for itself. Now, in my opinion, in the longer run, that can be a healthy, good thing. And even something like the Gulf crisis, for example, that's established something of competing different blocks. The Turkey-Qatari relationship isn't yet a fully crystallized bloc, but it's a strategic alliance which provides a balance, let's say, with everything else that you have in the region. It can potentially produce an equilibrium, which is critical for stability, a sensitive balance of power that can ensure there isn't one particular regional hegemon, that can ensure that one country or a set of countries aren't imposing their will, imposing themselves on the region. And again, so in the longer run, that certainly, I think, will be healthy and is crucial. But the question is, at what cost? What costs have to be paid before we get to that level? Syria, I think, will continue to shape the geopolitics of the region. Firstly, because it's established in Iran, in the Iran-Russia, let's say, alliance, in the Iran-Russia-Assad, one would say maybe even Baghdad alliance, a potential regional hegemon in the making. I agree with my colleague on the panel that that might not be a specific target of Iran, but it certainly has been a byproduct or a consequence of the way things have unfolded in the region. And if you look at the scholarship, the literature, whether it applies to the Middle East or elsewhere, when that happens, that creates a lot of uncertainty. And we see now how the region, the Arab world in particular, has become a lot more assertive in its rhetoric, its narrative, in its purchasing of weapons, in its doubling down of efforts in other theaters of conflict to undermine its rivals at the opposite end of the spectrum. The West is in decline because the international rules-based order itself is in decline. But is this simply a blip, simply a short-term decline, or is this something that will continue? I think until these other so-called new actors embrace the rules-based international order, the institutions that have evolved, emerged, have become critical to the international system since the end of the Second World War, the US and the West, in quotation marks, will continue to be the dominant actor. Because again, Russia certainly has invested heavily, it certainly has an economic strategy, but I don't see a vision. I see it more as a disruptor, a country that wants to simply disrupt the US presence in the region, and that's about it. China has a vision, it has a strategy, it's ambitious, but again, is that simply it? If you speak to people in the region, and I'm sure this can apply to anywhere here in Turkey as well, there is still a limited understanding of China. And that's why I'm still skeptical that these countries can really, truly replace the West as an alternative. And really, do they want to stick around? The US, the West, whether it's Europe, for example, has invested heavily in things like education, in things like civil society, in technology, in innovation. And really, while there might be problems in Washington, D.C., in Europe, with the rise of populist far-right groups, there is still that, let's say, parallel network of institutions, of organizations that still promote the ideals, the values that have been owned and championed by the West, by the US as well. And at the same time, I think in Russia and China, you still have rather fragile countries at home. Their policies still are undertaken with one eye certainly on their problems at home, whether it's the potential for a revolution, whether it's events unfolding in the Korean Peninsula, whether it's still ongoing Russian suspicions of the US, of the West. So really, I don't think they have that capacity even to take their eye of those problems they have at home to truly and fully invest in the Middle East. And that should send alarm bells in the region, because quite frankly, Russia and China will, if things get too rough, if things get too costly, pack up and go home. We haven't really spoken enough, I think, on the strings and the conditions that China attaches to its investments. They're still rather opaque. They still could potentially and probably are emboldening, reinforcing the despots, the corrupt elites, the components, the ingredients that essentially provide an environment that is conducive to further instability, to volatility. And things will get worse, again, because it's one of perception, I think. And really, if we're talking about the region, I always say, let's talk about Turkey and Iran. There's only really two countries in the region that have the capacity, that for reasons of history, that for reasons of ambition even, are capable of reimposing something of an order in the region, establishing the rules, the constraints, the limits, the conditions that can ensure 500,000 people aren't killed in Syria. But that will require more interventionist, more outward-looking foreign policies, particularly on the part of a power, a regional power like Turkey. Coming back to the perception of Iran and why I think things will get worse, the growing perception of Iran as a regional hegemon simply will be unacceptable to the region at large, but also to the Americans, which are clearly positioning themselves for a confrontation with Iran. And it really comes down to how these countries envision their status, but also whether they want to engage in the business of rebuilding states, refashioning societies. The Syria conflict, again, is no longer about the Syrian people, unfortunately. It really is, or has become, a battle for regional supremacy, a battle for dominance over the Middle East itself. Thank you.